I welcome you to this session on agricultural environmental provisions in regional trade agreements held by ISSD. I'm Jean-Marc Chapuis. I'm the Deputy Director of the Federal Office for Agriculture in Switzerland, and I am also a member of the team that is taking part in the conference. I will make a few introductory words. Because Switzerland, why is Switzerland interested in these environmental provisions in regional trade agreements? Then I will present the panelists. They will make their presentation, and then we will open the floor for questions. So let me start with a few introductory words. Dear panelists and colleagues, let me start by thanking the FAO for organizing today's session, but also for holding an interesting and diverse series of events and discussions at the margins of the WTO Ministerial Conference. Such events provide for a platform to exchange views, discuss best practices, find inspiration, and also for international organizations to make sure that their efforts are aligned. It's something important for us, that the efforts are aligned and can support each other's work. I'm honored also to moderate this panel, which touches upon the complex but important topic of the inclusion of environmental provisions related to agriculture, fisheries, and forestry in regional trade agreements. Switzerland is a small, landlocked country in the middle of Europe. Trade is important both for our wealth and our food security. Given that we import more than half of what we eat, it is understandable that we are concerned about the impact of trade on sustainability, including the environment. In 2017, the Swiss sovereign included a provision on food security in the federal constitution by a people's vote. It requires the federal government to apply a food system approach from production to consumption, including by enabling cross-border trade that contributes to the sustainable development of the agriculture and food sector. Maintaining trade flows and diversifying production and supply is critical to adapt to and mitigate disruptions and strengthen resilience. The challenges we face are manifold. Trade and its contribution to sustainable development has to be part of the answer. For Switzerland, it has long been clear that no country can address these challenges by itself, and that cross-sectorial, multi-stakeholder, as well as international collaboration is required to effectively transform our food systems. Switzerland's foreign economic policy strategy takes the tension between trade and environmental protection into account. It defines the many areas of work Switzerland engages in with the objective of maximizing the positive effects of trade on the environment while limiting the negative ones. As a member of the WTO and other international organizations and bodies, Switzerland supports a range of initiatives aimed at finding better solutions for the consideration of the environment when trading. We actively participate in the development of international standards, a central element for supporting environmental protection in trade. Our multilateral engagement is complemented by plurilateral work, such as the Swiss participation in the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, ACCTS, and for bilateral negotiations, Switzerland conducts targeted scientific assessments ahead of important economic agreements, which are then taken into account during negotiations. We include binding provisions on sustainability in our free trade negotiations or free trade agreements, and in the case of goods whose production processes are potentially highly problematic from a sustainability point of view, the linking of market access concessions to compliance with sustainability standards is examined. A novel approach we applied in the first time in the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with Indonesia. Let me conclude my introductory remarks by stressing that the magnitude and impact of trade on the environment calls for strengthened and more systematic global collaboration and partnerships. Switzerland is convinced that we can only face this challenge by working together and striving every day for doing a better job than the day before. Thanks for your attention to my introductory words. We are now going into the presentations and today's panel. The panel will discuss the linkages between trade and the environment, the evolution of the inclusion of agricultural environmental provisions in regional trade agreements, their effectiveness in mitigating environmental impacts, particularly greenhouse gas emissions related to agriculture, and the challenges for policymakers. The panel will also discuss whether a multilateral approach would be more effective in addressing global environmental concerns through trade. In this regard, it is a great pleasure to introduce today's panelists. I will start with Edona Dervisholi. She has been working at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations since 2015. She currently serves as an economist within the Markets and Trade Division. Prior to her current position, she worked as a trade and partnership analyst at the Liaison Office for North America in Washington, D.C. Edona holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and economics, a master's degree in global political economy from the University of Akron, and has completed an executive education program in trade policy at Harvard University. Thank you. Cosimo Avezzani is a trade policy analyst in the market and trade divisions of FAO. He's in charge of monitoring of agricultural trade negotiation at the multilateral and regional level. He leads on the development of training material and on agricultural trade policy and supervises the design and delivery of e-learning courses at the regional level. Before joining FAO, he served as a policy director at the Brussels office of the Transatlantic Business Council and as chief of staff in the cabinet of the Italian Deputy Minister for Foreign Trade. Cosimo holds a bachelor in international relations from the University of Bologna and a master in international politics and diplomacy from the University of Padua. Cosimo will follow up and provide some information about regional trade agreements and their relevance in the environment discussion. He will then elaborate on the Trade and Sustainable Agri-Food Systems project and the Agricultural Environmental Provisions Database. He will present the trends in the inclusion of agricultural environmental provisions in regional trade agreements and provide some final remarks. To conclude our panel, Jakob Schwab will present results on the effects of agricultural environmental provisions on environmental outcomes in agriculture. He will present a study which looked at how greenhouse gas emissions evolved in countries that included agricultural environmental provisions in their relevant regional trade agreements. He will also talk about the channels of these effects and conclude with the implications provisions can have for the environment. Jakob is a policy consultant and an associate researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. He holds a PhD in economics from the Gutenberg University of Mainz. His research covers topics of development economics, international trade, investment, trade and the environment, taxation, and income mobility. Jakob has, among others, advised for the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and its service providers, as well as international fora such as the G20. He is also a research fellow at the Global Justice Program at Yale University. Let's start now with the presentation. Edona, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shakul, for a very kind introduction to this panel. Good morning, everyone. I'm Edona Dragasholi. I'm an economist in the Markets and Trade Division at FAO. I'm delighted to be here and start our conversation by looking at the relationship between agriculture, trade, and environment. To start off, let me start by saying that trade can help us allocate agricultural production to regions where the amount of natural resources such as land and water used per unit of food is relatively lower. That is, that land and water for use efficiency is relatively higher. So trade could generate between 40 to 60 cubic meters of annual water savings per capita. In addition, trade in cereals is estimated to enable annual land savings in the magnitude of 50 million hectares. But without trade, countries will have to significantly increase consumption of water as well as cropland area. At the same time, trade can also result in negative environmental impacts. That is, that production for exports can in fact result in unsustainable freshwater withdrawal, pollution, biodiversity loss, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. That is, that about 11% of groundwater depletion is estimated to be embedded in the international trade of crops. And between 2000 and 2010, production of cattle, soybeans, and palm oil, all products with sustained global demand, accounted for 40% of tropical deforestation. And against this backdrop, we'll look at just an example of climate change in agriculture. So in addition to pollution, biodiversity, loss, and deforestation, agriculture in 2020 food systems and greenhouse gas emissions amounted to 16 billion tons of carbon dioxide, equivalent to 31% of total emissions. But if climate change affects agriculture, and this map on the left side shows that agriculture production could be affected in 2050. The red shaded areas denote a decrease in production, and green reflects an increase in yields. This gives us a glance of how climate change will impact agriculture in the short and long term. In the short term, an increasing likelihood of extreme events such as droughts, floods, and storms with potential damaging effects on crops and livestock are expected to affect production. As you can see, on average, in low altitudes, where most developing countries are located, a warmer planet will mean lower yields. This is because higher temperatures in tropics will affect crop growth relatively and negatively. In the long term, climate change is expected to result in declines in agricultural production in large parts of Africa, Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, and these declines are projected to be more pronounced in West Africa. It decreased by nearly 3%, and in India with a decrease of 2.6%. In temperate countries that are mostly developed economies, higher temperatures may have a positive effect on crop yields. But what's important to note is that the impact will be uneven across countries as well as regions. But this leads up to the changes in comparative advantage of agriculture, which will impact on trade. For example, North America, Europe, and Central Asia could increase exports to North Africa, the Near East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. Africa will also be on the receiving ends of exports from all regions in the world, but this also showcases that trade has an adaptation role in ensuring food security and nutrition, while functioning markets can strengthen this role. However, we have to note that low-income net importing countries that are affected by climate change may be unable to meet their food import bills. Now, when we talk about environmental externalities such as climate change, we have to zoom in and look at the localized and global environmental externalities. Many externalities can be local or regional, such as unsustainable groundwater withdrawals, land degradation, as well as pollution. But globally valued, such as biodiversity loss, may be localized, but biodiversity and ecosystems may be globally valued. However, agricultural production takes place in a region, but the effects of climate change are globally spread, as they are indivisibly spread around the entire planet, which affects many economic activities. Its costs are not accounted by markets, and the benefits for mitigating its impact may be divided, but may not be claimed by anyone. And that is important in the context of the trade policy, as it shapes different policy levels. Against this backdrop, we look at and survey the policy space that we have available to respond to this relationship. First, we start the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development does reinforce the idea that open, non-discriminatory multilateral trading system and actions that protect the environment and promote sustainable development can be mutually supportive. At the same time, the Paris Agreement under UNFCCC also explicitly states that measures taken to combat climate change should not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or disguised restrictions on international trade. We have to note that common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities are also noted in that. At the same time, we have the World Trade Organization, that countries have a significant level of autonomy in determining their environmental objectives and legislations, particularly Article 20 of the GATS Agreement, as well as the Agreement on Agriculture, as well as the principle of non-discrimination. However, there's no fundamental conflict between environmental or climate change policies and multilateral trade rules. WTO rules have discouraged unfair practices and reduced uncertainty, and this gives countries the ability to also negotiate bilaterally or regionally, which leads us to looking at the regional trade agreements. So the multilateral policy framework is also complemented by a multitude of RTAs. As you can see, the number of regional trade agreements by countries in 2022 has increased significantly, and the regional trade agreements have become deeper over time and include environmental related provisions, such as those that perhaps later my colleague Cosimo will allude to. As well as regional trade agreements can create gains, but we have to also bear in mind that low-income countries could be left out of the trade integration process. And some of the key takeaways we have to note that trade can increase the efficiency of natural resources use, but trade can result in negative environmental impacts such as unsustainable water withdrawals. But trade can have an adaptation role in ensuring food security, as well as well-functioning markets can strengthen this role further. Environmental externalities such as pollution can be local or regional, and the rise of RTAs, including environmental-related provisions, can address such externalities. But note that global environmental externalities such as climate change can be addressed effectively through multilateralism. And to end things on a positive note, we have to note that countries have made important environmental efforts through the WTO, including tariff reductions for eco-friendly goods, clarifying WTO rules regarding trade obligations and environmental agreements, and limiting harmful subsidies. However, international cooperation is indispensable to maximize environmental benefits and minimize risks associated with trade. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. we move on to Cosimo.
Sure. So good morning, everybody. Actually, I was thinking about moving this side because it looks a bit weird to not look at you. So basically, in this presentation, we will be briefly looking at the, let's say, what is between regional trade agreement and environmental related provisions. We'll look at the scope of the database that we've been created within FAO through this project that we started with the financial support of the Swiss government and how we did collect this information. We will then look at the trends in what we call Ag-ERPs, which stands for environmental related provisions that are linked to the agriculture, forestry and fisheries sectors. And we conclude with some final remarks. So we know that the relationship between trade and environment is extremely important. And as well, we know that the three sectors that are under scrutiny, so agriculture, fisheries, and forestry, are extremely interdependent with the environment, and basically they depend on it to strive. An easy example, I mean, we know that healthy soils are necessary for agriculture, clean water is necessary for fishing, and so on. But also agricultural trade can play a role on the environment with mixed impacts. If we look at the negative impacts, we know that production for export, let's say, can lead to increased pollution. And at the same time, when we have trade liberalization, we know that some pollution intensive activities in some specific countries can increase. On the other side, trade can definitely improve, as Donna was saying before, the allocation of production among countries to make basically trade more resource efficient. And at the same time, when we have open markets, we know as well that technologies can go better around the globe, and we can have local production that become more efficient. And basically for this reason, over the last 10-15 years, policymakers, trade negotiators started to understand that the balance between trade liberalization and sustainable development became more and more important. But here today we're talking about RTAs. I would start by saying what we mean with RTA, because sometimes we say FTA, we use the official, let's say, WTO language. So when we say RTAs, we say all trade agreements of mutually preferential nature, and we're talking about bilateral, plurilateral, regional, free trade areas, customs unions, common markets, and of course economic unions. The legal basis, of course, is interesting because it's Article 24 of the GATT, which you perfectly know in this room that the basic principle, one of the basic principles of the WTO or the multilateral trading system is the MFN principle, and this specific article is what basically waives countries from implementing, let's say, at any time the MFN principle. And we see as well some global trends. What are these global trends? Well, we saw that in the last few years we have more and more regional trade agreements in the world, and these regional trade agreements are between developed countries, and between these countries. Why do we have so many? Basically because compared to multilateral trade negotiations, as we can see these days, having a bilateral agreement may be definitely easier. You reduce the parties that are involved, and of course the conclusion can be more swift. And what we can see as well is that the latest trend is to pursue this, let's say, this kind of integration that goes beyond trade liberalization. So we have as well an incorporation of provision that encompass different areas, social protection, so on, including environmental related provisions. What are they? ERPs, they can be defined as provisions that are referring directly and explicitly to the protection of the environment and sustainable development. Their scope can be extremely broad, like we can see general cooperation is normally included in the preamble of an agreement, or specific obligations, so detailed obligation, the specific clause on forestry, for instance. Where do we have them? Basically everywhere in an agreement. They can be in a preamble, they can be in a specific chapter, they can be inside letters, they can be inside agreement, etc. And their objective is clear. At times you want, the other countries to avoid to attract investments just by reducing the level of environmental protection in the country, or you want to contribute to the overarching overarching goal of sustainable development. And in some cases, you also include ERPs because you want more political support for your RTA. Of course, because this topic is becoming more and more important in the global arena, more attention has been paid to it. And over the last 15 years, we're having more and more studies looking at the effect of ERPs in RTAs. And this is just a very brief summary of some of the most important studies that have been created over the last years. And below you see some examples of databases, because of course, with the provision of a database, you can then improve the quality as well of your studies. And here I'm mentioning basically three, just as an example. The first one is from Moran of the University of Laval, which is called a trend database, which is very important, let's say, for economic understanding of the situation. The one from Montero and Trachman, that was done in a project from the World Bank, is a very interesting database that looks, it's more, let's say, qualitative compared to the one of trend. And the last one is just an example to show that as well at the regional level, there are many organizations that are working through the creation of databases. And the key topics that we discussed so far are basically the impact of the ERPs on air quality. We have the linkage between ERPs and deforestation, some general trends, let's say, in ERPs, which is specifically the case of the World Bank study. But when we were writing the State of Agricultural Commodity Markets 2022, that is the trade flagship publication of FAO, we realized basically that there was no database nor study that was looking only at the agriculture, fishery and forestry sectors. And therefore, again, with the kind help of the Swiss government, we set up this project on trade and sustainable agriculture systems, and we were looking at how to fix this issue. And we had two specific outputs. First one, the creation of a database on ERPs, and second, an analysis of the trends for inclusion of these Ag-ERPs in regional trade agreements. So we created a database which expands on the trend database, and we cover 318 RTAs that were notified to the WTO and that entered into force between 1995, so the establishment of the WTO, and 2022. And then we assessed the general trends. Plus, and this thanks to Jacob, we have as well a study on the environmental outcomes of Ag-ERPs. But let's look at the database. So as I was saying before, the database builds on the trends database, so it was meant for economic analysis, and we incorporate only provisions that are clearly linking to the agricultural, forestry and fishery sectors, and that, again, that's why the name Ag-ERPs. We have 318 RTAs. We divided the database in 11 categories that basically follow the same categories that you can find in the trends database, and we found 142 different types of Ag-ERPs. Some of them, as I was saying before, with a direct impact on the three sectors under scrutiny. An example is, for instance, a specific clause on fisheries conservation, or with indirect impact, which is, let's say, the biggest chunk, I would say, of the provision, more than 2/3. Which are those provisions that look, generally speaking, on the environment in an RTA. How we did that? That was not an easy thing, in the sense that we had to literally reread all 318 RTAs. It was a pleasure. And we tried to understand, on the basis of the language, the nature, the scope, and the location of each single provision, what they meant, and if these provisions effectively were aiming at addressing these issues in the agriculture, fishery and forestry sectors, or, as I was saying before, they could have covered them because they were broad enough to include them. And we created some, so as I was saying before, 142 provisions. Some of them were already included in the trend database, some others we had to create ourselves. For instance, we have one on antimicrobial resistance that was not included before, but we thought it was extremely important as well in the consideration of the One Health approach. We have some on wildlife trafficking, zero crime, that looks basically at the issue of the problem of biodiversity, and as well sustainable food system, as Jean-Marc was saying before, that basically this is a clause that was included recently in RTAs, but if we look at RTAs as they were written before, we could see basically these kind of provisions were already there in, let's say, in some way. And now the trends. So the inclusion of ERPs, of Ag-ERPs, since establishment of the WTO has increased really steadily. Although the number of provisions fluctuated somehow over time, if we look at the red line, which is the average number, we can see that basically it always went up through the period we have been assessing. And all in all, we saw that the average number of Ag-ERPs and RTAs went from 4 at the beginning, so 1995, and we had a peak of 41 in 2018. Of course, there is a big difference here between the number of RTAs and the average number of Ag-ERPs, and we know the reason. For instance, if we see here in 2021, we have this huge peak, basically as a cause of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. So the average is extremely important in these times. And if we look here at the periods, what we can see is that, first of all, we have a rise in the total number of Ag-ERPs when we look at the periods, and if we look at the number of RTAs, we clearly see that the average number has been growing over time. And if we see the percentages of growth over time, this is actually massive. Probably these latest figures of the 2018-2022 is kind of smaller compared to the others, but for the simple reason that the period analyzed, if you see the numbers, is rather shorter compared to the other period, which is a 7-year time period. And we look at the, let's say, we zoom in on the curve of trends. So here we look at the average number of Ag-ERPs for South-South, North-South, and North-North RTAs. Here when we say South, we intend the Global South. There is no specific definition for Global South, but we took, let's say, the definition of UNDP for the classification of developing countries. So in here what you see is that all South countries basically are all the developing countries according to UNDP. All the North countries are the ones that are outside of the scope. And the rise was significant. And we can see here that basically, depending on the type of agreements, so South-South, North-South, and North-North, of course we have different averages. The most important one, of course, is the North-North, following North-South, and finally the South-South. But it's interesting to see that although we would expect that these provisions are only in agreements with North countries, this is actually not true, because over time as well, South-South agreements started including this type of provisions. And now some final remarks. So we said that the relationship between trade and environment is extremely important, and we just saw how Ag-ERPs have increased steadily in the period that we assessed. But research really is needed, because as we were saying before, there is no evidence, there are no research on what we have been starting here last year. So what we can see is that it's extremely fundamental in this field that we improve the collaboration between all the international actors to try to have more information on the issue, and to ensure that the discussions are not only, let's say, brought to the bilateral table, but are brought on the multilateral table at the multilateral level. We need to keep monitoring the effects of trade agreements and Ag-ERPs, which is exactly what we started with the work of Jakob. And it's important as well to support demand drive capacity building for specifically for developing countries, because there is the risk, of course, that the spread of ERPs in RTAs might increase this spaghetti ball as well in the field of environment. And how can we use the database? So here you can see the two publications we just released at FAO just Friday last week. The first one, which is basically what I just explained to you, and the next one, which is environmental outcomes in agriculture, which is what Jakob will be speaking shortly. But the database it's a very cool database. Why? Because you can do economic analysis. And in the next year, again with the kind support of the Swiss government, we will be looking as well at how these Ag-ERPs are, for instance, affecting the trade flows. And we will look at the effect of Ag-ERPs on the specific outcomes, environmental outcomes, on fisheries, on deforestation and so on. And we look as well at how Ag-ERPs have been impacting the legislation in, let's say, the domestic legislation of country. So whether the negotiation or implementation of an RTA had an effect of improving the legislation on the environment in specific countries. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't bore you, and pass the floor to Jakob.
Thank you so much, Cosimo. Yes, I will present the second study, basically, so my talk will be based on that. The main results, which is the first view at the actual effect of these Ag-ERPs on environmental outcomes in the signatory countries to the respective regional trade agreements. The study is joined with Professor Clara Brandi from the University of Bonn and also IDOS. And yes, you can look it up. So why did we start with, when we think about environmental outcomes, with looking particularly at greenhouse gas emissions? Well, as Idona said, agriculture is a huge contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. So what is happening on the farms itself, which is what we look at here, is around 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the land use and land use change, if you look at agri-food systems overall, that's even higher, that number. Now, in the middle of the climate crisis, that's of course an important issue that we want to look at. And given that agricultural products are so intensively traded, and that may even become more important, right? In kind of the circle that goes on with climate, with the effects of the climate crisis. Now, it seems promising to regulate that through the system of regional trade agreements by including environmental provisions related to agriculture, forestry, and fisheries in these regional trade agreements. Now, what we wanted to do in our study is to see whether those Ag-ERPs that have been concluded until now actually had that effect, namely reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in the signatory countries. Now we have that data thanks to the FAO and the Swiss government, and we wanted to look at whether that we want to use that data to see whether they had this effect. Now, as Cosimo already said, so I'll be quick. There is some research on environmental related provisions in RTAs in general. And overall, we already know that environment-related provisions in RTAs can have effects on environmental outcomes. As Cosimo said, overall environmental performance in developing countries, partner countries of US and EU, RTAs, deforestation, air pollution, and also we see greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, effects from environment-related provisions in general. Although I have to say the finding on greenhouse gas emissions is a bit mixed. That depends on the setting, whether you see effects or not, the type of provisions and so on. So just to keep that in mind. Now, what we want to look at is particularly to fill the gap that Cosimo just mentioned before, to look at whether there is an effect of environmental-related provisions that relate to agriculture on outcomes in agriculture in particular, right? And our main focus here, we look at other things, we started to look at other things a bit, but our main focus here is on greenhouse gas emissions happening on the farm, that is methane and nitrous oxide emissions due to the use of fertilizers, which are the main contributor here to greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Now what we did, I won't go too technical, but we took data from the FAO on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. We take them in CO2 equivalents, and then we use the data, and right now we are just as a simple first approach, simply take the number of Ag-ERPs that are included in a country's RTA. Of course, as we saw before, there is many RTAs, and countries have RTAs with many countries. So we weighted this number of RTAs of Ag-ERPs in an RTA by the relevance of the respective partner in overall agricultural trade to arrive at a number of how many Ag-ERPs a country has included in their relevant RTAs for agricultural trade. Okay, that's kind of our impact or treatment variable. Now, we took a panel of countries, 190 countries and territories over the period from 1995, from where we start to have data on these Ag-ERPs to 2019, because we only have the data on the environmental outcomes and so on until there. And what we did as our estimation strategy, to put it non-technical, we compared how greenhouse gas emissions evolved in the countries that had more Ag-ERPs included in their relevant RTAs to the development of the greenhouse gas emissions in countries that have included less or no Ag-ERPs in their respective in their relevant RTAs. Now, what you see here is basically that variable, so the number of Ag-ERPs for countries weighted by the relevance of all trading partners in agricultural trade, and the 25 countries that have the highest number of that have included the most Ag-ERPs in their relevant RTAs. Now, what you see, the main takeaway here, I would say, is this is a quite mixed group of countries. Okay, so this is not very regionally concentrated. You see some not by country development groups. You see that there is developing countries, so Peru, Panama, Colombia, but that's not only Latin America here, right? As developing countries, but you also see Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, right? So you also see high-income countries in that group that have included these Ag-ERPs in their relevant RTAs. Now, we looked at whether in these countries were greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture reduced after the signing of these RTAs, and we see the main takeaway here is highlighted in blue. We see there is an effect. So we see that both methane and nitrous oxide emissions, that's the second and third column respectively, were reduced after the signing of RTAs with these Ag-ERPs, and that of course results in overall reduction, that's the first column, of CO2 equivalents emissions from agriculture. We also see that this effect is sizable, so that's the effect of one Ag-ERP on average on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's in size about half a percentage point reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture per Ag-ERP. So you have 40 or so up to more than 40 average Ag-ERPs in a country. For Peru, for example, that's a very sizable effect that you have on greenhouse gas emissions here. What we did a bit, just to start thinking about more on that, well, it's of course interesting and be relevant for the policy discussions, what the respective channels are that we see here. Now, we have three that come to mind very immediately, and that is, well, one, entering RTAs with Ag-ERPs may make countries or governments inclined to increase their domestic environmental regulation, right? And then producers react to that. The second might be, so that's the indirect effect via domestic environmental regulation, and then there might be a direct effect through provisions that relate to cooperation or they're very diverse set, but you can imagine very many channels that have direct effects of these ERPs. Now, these again can be twofold. So one could be, okay, well, it makes the more demands that are put to the agricultural production may decrease agricultural production, which is something that we may want, but typically that may also come with, for example, adverse economic effects, right, at some point. Or that kind of at given levels of production here, right? It could be that these are less emission intensive, right? That the same amount of production takes place at less emissions, which is something that sounds good. I mean, that depends a bit on the context, right? But so these are the three channels that we think are kind of obvious and that we can try to dissect a bit by doing that. Now, what we do is we consider 1 and 2 explicitly because we have data on that, and that is the domestic environmental regulation and the agricultural land use. And we would take kind of what is not explained by that, right, would be the third mechanism, that is at given levels of domestic environmental regulation and land use, you see a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? What we do is we run a mediation analysis here, what we did, to consider the size of the effect, so how much of the association between Ag-ERPs and greenhouse gas emissions goes along with either the first, the second, or then the third channel here. And the result of that is displayed here. We do see an association with both, with domestic environmental regulation and with reduced agricultural land use. I don't know whether you can see the pointer if I move it on. But they are not too large. So, I mean, the data is not perfect for domestic environmental regulation. It's also a count variable of the number of regulations that you have here. But in the countries where the association was particularly strong between Ag-ERPs and the reduction, we don't see too much change in domestic environmental regulation. We see a positive association. We see that it's driven by that it goes along, but it's not too big. Same thing for land use. We see that agricultural land use is reduced in the respective countries, but it doesn't explain the overall association between Ag-ERPs and the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and we see that a large part cannot be explained by the two. As I said, the exact numbers taken with a bit of caution here, but you see that there is an association that is not related to either of the two, which is of course interesting. Now, key takeaway from this, I'll keep it simple. We see that Ag-ERPs are associated with reduced greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Following that, and this is partially driven by both environmental regulation, a reduction in land use, but also other factors, other direct effects that we see here. What does this imply? Well, the design of trade agreements does matter. Environmental provisions do matter for environmental outcomes, which is, I guess, good news for this room, good information for maybe the WTO discussions. Going beyond that, of course, what we also want to think about is making ERPs even more effective, right? And there's many channels that you can think about, cooperation with non-state actors and so on, so even increase that effect, of course. You can see this, you can find this presentation, and also I'm available for questions now and whenever. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Edona, Cosimo, and Jakob for your interesting insights and contribution. Switzerland appreciates very much the work, the normative work of FAO in general, and in that case on the agricultural environmental provisions in regional trade agreements. I'm sure your presentations have raised some questions among listeners. The floor is open for questions. Yes, please.
Thank you, all three presenters. Best presentation I've seen these last days. Thanks, all three, with a lot of information and good information. I have a question for all three, if I may. A question to you. I'm sorry, I cannot read your names.
Let's move it next.
Great, thank you so much. Mr. Dona, you showed the 2050 change in agricultural production because of climate change. You know which scenario you used? Do you use an IPCC scenario, and which one? And if I may first ask the other one the questions too, and then maybe answer. So, Cosimo, thanks, great presentation. So we just saw one evaluation. So are you wanting to do all these evaluations for all these ERPs that you showed, and for all countries and all data, and what kind of baseline would you take? And Jacob, was a great presentation. I would like to understand your bar graph and then your conclusion, because your bar graph, you had a few powerhouses of agriculture expansion as Brunei and Iceland, and then your conclusion was that more ERPs gives higher reduction, and I didn't entirely understand that, or maybe I just misunderstood that. Those two slides I wasn't entirely got. My other question to you, agriculture is 20%, but you actually know that is actually land use change and cattle. Row crops is actually not a big deal. Yeah. And so I wonder if you find that back in your ERPs, that the most reductions are ERPs that handle land use change and cattle. Sorry for my long question.
Okay, Edana,
sure.
Start.
If I may use it, I can just refer to it. So the specific actual figure that you're referring to was carried out back in 2018 in one of our flagship reports, as Cosimo stated earlier, the State of Food and Agriculture Commodity Markets. And, sorry, this might take a while.
Go very far back.
Maybe, do you want to?
I can do it.
I meant if you want to do it.
I'll start answering maybe because
Yeah,
I don't need
no,
the slide. You saw the bar graph exactly. There are some countries where you would ask yourself. I mean, this is very illustrative cases there, and it would be interesting to see. By definition, with this large N study, we kind of cannot say something about individual effects, whether we observe that too. It's actually a good point, and we haven't done that yet. Something to look at, to exclude cases. So to see if we take Brunei out, what happens to the overall effect, just to see whether this is something that drives the results or that goes contrary to the results, that special case, to the average results, which is what we present here. This was the 25 cases with the highest number, which is of course something that's driven. But on general, on average, so taking all 191 countries, we see that more Ag-ERPs included do actually lead to higher or greater reductions here. Yes, and maybe same answer to the second one. Good point, good question. That's something that we want to look at now to see kind of which type of provision particularly has strong effects, and then maybe particularly on cases. So do we see that provisions on land use change do affect land use in particular also simply, right? So this type of question is something that we want to look at. I cannot say it right now which type because we haven't, but that's a good point, and I'll take that down. So kind of this next stage of the project to look at the particular design. So right now it's only the bird's eye perspective. Is there an effect to look at the specifics to see which provisions make a difference, and that we want to look at. Thanks for the.
I think Jakob covered most of my answer as well. But the point is that, as I was saying before, because this database is so new, even among ourselves, we are still exploring in which direction we can go for the next research. So that's why before I was mentioning you that we will have these 3 new studies coming up probably next year or early 2025. And of course we will try to see the relation between, we said types of Ag-ERPs, because as we say specific Ag-ERP would mean that specific clause in that specific agreement. So when we mean types of ERPs is, for instance, the one on sustainable food systems. Okay, so it's a kind of a broader scope compared to the specific one. But we will try, as we were saying before, with these 2 studies. So as he was mentioning before on the trade flows, one with the specific outcomes, and this will tell us probably where we can go after those studies. But first we need to go step by step, because again, it's the first time this kind of analysis has been carried out. So we're in this phase, which is kind of exciting, but as well we are as well trying to understand how much we can put forward.
So, as mentioned earlier, this was a research conducted by Wageningen Research, Economic Research Department as a background paper for one of our flagship reports. I cannot specify the exact data sets that they used to have this calculation, which I can provide later. But they did use FAO stats as well as to combine the different variables. But they do use the baseline in the climate change relative to the baseline for, I believe it was from 2011. So,
but also the one before this one, you have this Africa, the agriculture yields, I think you have, and you have all this red and green.
Yes.
And it seems one of the IPCC ones, yes. But the worst outcome, 250. I'm not entirely sure, or is it? That one, yeah. I was just wondering about.
Yes, this one is included in the same background research. I
Same,
can provide
okay.
you with the exact.
Yeah, that's fine. I just wondered about. It looked a bit worse than I was used to, but this
Okay.
might be more legal.
But again, this is
There's
really the
the
baseline.
yeah.
Sure.
So it doesn't mean that production will go necessarily down
Sure.
in all areas.
Yeah.
Simply climate change, this is an climate change compared to what we would have without climate change.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Ivar coming from Finland, my north there in Europe. So, but the question is actually linked to what you mentioned is that that is the potential. What could happen? But when I'm looking, for example, what is happening there in EU and in Brussels policy, that what kind of climate policy and what kind of regulation they will have, and then restrictions on production policy. So I can't see at the moment the possibility that the European Union is as green as it is there in your map on 2050, because of those limitations of the policy side. But anyhow, have you any analysis on that side of what is actually happening with the climate policy or environmental policy, and what is its effect on those potential what we have in production?
I think that's an ongoing challenge for everyone involved, not just for FAO, but other organizations that conduct more or less the same research. But from different aspects, we do look at this, not just currently, but also foreseeing from 2030, 2040, and 2050. I think it's too early to say that the results will be a bit mixed, even for us to forecast at this case, but this is sort of a starting point for us also to kind of narrow it down a bit to look at different elements that may be embedded in terms of the policy space. Perhaps for countries that are based out of the EU might be much easier compared to countries that are located especially near the equator that experience significant climate change challenges. Do you want to add or comment?
No, I mean, nothing particular, but simply, as we were saying before, these comes from SOCO 2018, and we didn't carry out new analysis. So this is the last available we have, let's say, in our division for this specific thing. So of course things might have been changed as well a bit. And as you know, there are different models that can show different results, let's say, in what can be depending on the country. The point is that this is a very complicated model, and probably we will rerun it in the future. But this really is the last one we have. It's just to showcase the fact that things will happen, like it or not, things will happen, and they will have an impact. And we need to start thinking about that.
As you said, that is a good baseline. That what is the potential there, and on that sense, it is so important to have that kind of data.
Yeah.
Thank you. We can take a last question. Yes, please, Bert.
We are Grizzly from the Swiss Farmers Union, and I thank you all for these very good presentations and analyses, and also thank you, Jean-Marc, for hosting this discussion. SFU, Swiss Farmers Union, is also on the national level pushing a lot for ERPs in EFTA agreements and bilateral agreements. But if we make, let's say, not scientific research, but if we make some research about the effect of it, we found that the direct effect is rather low in the real markets. I'm talking of the real markets. But what we see is the effect is rather big on the level of private initiatives. So probably this is the big share on your on the circle, the bigger the share on your circle, where is a huge potential inside. And the question is, how could these agreements, these ERPs, be built that private initiatives are facilitated? Because there we see in the market a very big effect if the private actors start to move. That's a difficult question, but maybe you can also.
Guys, you want to start? I start.
Later.
So as we were saying before, one of the big challenges here is probably what we will be looking in the future, and what we see that additional research is definitely needed is how these Ag-ERPs are written. Okay, because we now made an assessment of all the Ag-ERPs that are available, but we do not know if that very specific one is more effective than another. So even understanding the way these Ag-ERPs can be more effective, we are trying to understand that. And as he was saying before, even the fact that, for instance, are these Ag-ERPs mandatory? So are they enforceable or not under the trade agreement? This can make a difference. At the moment, we do not know. Like, for instance, the analysis we have so far, which has been done from the OECD, is that whether or not the Ag-ERPs are mandatory or better mandatory, enforceable through the RTA, may not change if, for instance, there is a lot of capacity building put placed from the country that is, let's say, negotiating these Ag-ERPs with the country. So the answer is we do not know. We have to research. We have to better understand what can be done, what Ag-ERPs will be the better in addressing the cause. But the honest answer is, at this stage, we don't know.
Maybe I can just add, but also a kind of researcher type answer. Of course, to inform this, the specific design, right, we would find it helpful to more talk to people. So it's interesting to hear that that's kind of what you think, and maybe we can even talk afterwards to hear how people think about the channels, what is actually happening. For us then go back maybe and think about, can we see that? Can we prove that? Is it that actually? Is it that what we see in the data? Kind of what is an impression here? And it would be interesting to hear that. So thanks for that impression first, and maybe we can speak later.
Okay, so the conversation will be carried on around a coffee, but for this session we have to close it because there will be a next session afterwards, and Switzerland looks forward to continue building on this important and significant first set of evidence, which should feed into ongoing discussions at the national and international level. Many thanks to IISD, the FAO, and FAO Geneva as well, for all their work, and to all of you today for your interest and engagement in today's discussion. Thank you for joining us. Have a nice day. Thank you.